Hi there, and welcome to The Artist's Craft. I'm your host, Stacey Cochran, and we have an outstanding guest with us in studio today. Carl Hiaasen has been writing about Florida since his father gave him a typewriter at age 6. Nowadays, Hiaasen writes a column for the Miami Herald and is the author of many best-selling novels, including Sick Puppy and Nature Girl. Hoot, Hiaasen's first novel for young readers, was the recipient of numerous awards, including the prestigious Newbery Honor. And Flush, his second book for kids, spent more than a year on the New York Times bestseller list. Thank you very much for joining us here in Raleigh.
It's great to be here.
Welcome to our town. So the new book is Scat. I have a copy of here. Who do you see as your primary audience for Scat?
Well, I mean, if you listen to the various bestseller lists, it's always like the 8 to 12 age group, and I sort of have a middle school in my mind, but I've gotten letters from kids as young as 6 and 7 and as old as 75. So it just depends on who's interested in it, I guess. I guess when you sit down to write, you don't really think of who it is. In this case, the heroes of the novel are sort of middle school kids, so I assume that's who'll be drawn to it more.
Now, when you're out on tour for these, for this book, for Hoot and Flush, and now for Scat, what's the demographic that shows up at the stores?
It varies. I mean, a lot of kids show up, and so we do a lot of question and answers, and they usually have a very sharp question. They're very funny, and a lot of them come with their parents, or the parents that brought them, and then there's a lot of grown-ups who just show up. I guess fans of the other novels as well that are curious and will often buy the books for kids. They're very loyal, and I'm happy to see them too. But it's a mix.
So there's a lot of crossover with the books, that it sounds like.
There appears to be, and of course I want them to be very distinct because the grown-up novels are for grown-ups, and so they all have 2-word titles, and the novels for the kids all have 1-word title. And in the blurbs and all the publicity for those young novels, I don't mention or dwell on the other stuff, because I think there's a certain age when the kids are in their middle teens where they certainly can handle anything else that I'm writing. But I feel an 8 or 9-year-old, I'd rather not have them reading striptease just yet in their development. It may not be a good thing.
That makes perfect sense. Well, how is writing for a younger reader? How is that different? Is it any different when you sit down to a computer or?
Well, it's all storytelling, so in that sense, that's the muscle that you have to develop and use over and over again. But certainly, in my case, the trick is to sort of dial myself back more than a few years, and back when I was an adolescent, the way I looked at the world. And back then, I mean, even then, I was sort of writing little stories and poems or anything. But I look at the world pretty much the same way now as I did then. It's just a question of writing for that audience. But the attitude and the sort of the narrative, the tone, some of the satire and the humor is all in these books as well, because that's really the only voice I can write in. Obviously, there aren't going to be adult situations, and the language is going to be cleaned up. But the truth is that most 10, 11, 12-year-olds wouldn't find themselves in the same situations as the adult characters in the other novels. So it's not a stretch. It's not like I have to rein myself in or have my mom look over my shoulder while I'm reading it.
Well, you've written a few of these now. This is the third book for middle grade readers. I guess I'm curious. Do you have a preference now? Is one more enjoyable to write? Do you feel more satisfied by the end of writing a middle grades novel, or? I
think it's always the same. When you finish a novel, you do have a love-hate relationship. You've lived with those characters for so long, and you've rewritten. You've probably looked at each chapter 40 or 50 times, tinkered with it, rewritten it in some cases. So there's always the relief of being done, and then the next phase of it is months later when the book arrives from the publisher and you open it up, and how do you feel about it? And I feel good about both of them. I think in the case of the novels that I've been writing longest, the novels for grown-ups, it's certainly a writing exercise, a little bit different because the plots tend to be a little more complicated. There's a lot more backstory. The characters are more complicated because when a guy walks on stage in a grown-up novel and he's had 5 divorces, you pretty much have to spend some time explaining how he got to that point. But these kids sort of hit the ground running, and that for me is fun. It's kind of a liberating way to write. I don't have to worry about as many of the disturbing characters that appear in some of the other books.
So is it a little bit easier to write?
It's not easier, no, and I think a lot of you know, novelists who have tried their hand at writing for kids discovered the hard way that it isn't easy. They're a demanding audience. They're sharp. They're a funny audience. They get the jokes right away. They're perceptive, and they're candid in that wonderful way that kids can be with their criticism when they have criticism. So I wouldn't say it's easier. It's just it's a different kind of writing, and I enjoy it tremendously. In the feedback that you get from writing for young readers is you know, buckets and buckets of mail. And you just sit there and you read it, and it's a lot of it's amazing and it's wonderful and it's touching, and it makes you want to. It really makes you want to keep writing for that audience, because it's such a fresh, and they've got such a terrifically pure way, and they've also got a real sense of clarity about what's right and wrong in the world. And somewhere along the way, grown-ups sometimes lose that. Sometimes they come out with that MBA in their hand, and things that seemed very clear when they were young are a little fuzzier now. Ethical issues, moral issues, many layers of complications, where a kid is just looking at something and it's either right or it's wrong, and they're usually on the money with that.
Very good. Well, if you're just tuning in, you're watching The Artist Craft. I'm your host, Stacey Cochran, and we are absolutely honored and tickled pink to have Carl Hiaasen with us in studio. He is the author of Scat, as well as many other New York Times best-selling novels. And we've been talking a little bit about the difference between writing for younger readers and writing for more of an adult audience. When you first decided to write a young adult novel to actually publish, how did your agent and how did your publisher feel about that?
Well, it wasn't my idea, believe me. It never occurred to me to even try. I was approached by an editor at a competing publishing house, and I laughed the whole thing off, because I thought, no, you don't want to expose the youth of America to the way I think. And then my agent and my own editor at Knopf started talking to me about it and said, look, this is a natural thing, especially a connection with nature. You know, I grew up in South Florida, really just bumming around the Everglades, exploring all these neat places, many of which are gone today, sadly. But that was my childhood, and for me, the idea of being able to put that experience into print and letting maybe some other kids get the same kind of kick out of it that I did was appealing. So I took a chance, and also I had a lot of kids, and my stepson was young at the time. He was 11, and my nieces and nephews were young, and they were all clamoring to read my books, and I thought I better write something that I feel comfortable giving them, and that's where Hoot came from.
That's a great story. So how do they feel? How does the family feel about the book?
The kids are obviously all older now, and they've read some of the other novels, and they seem to be completely cool with it. And the best story is, you know, I was so protective. I said, look, you know, the characters in my other books, they've got lots of problems. I'm writing about corrupt politicians. I'm writing about all kinds of characters, and some of them use bad language every now and then. And so when my stepson was finally old enough, in his 15, 16, whenever he read one of the other novels, he just at me. He laughed in my face. He said, and you were worried about this? He said, you need to ride the school bus with me one day. So I had obviously had my own view of what he knew and didn't know. I think lots of parents feel that way. You know, it's stuff they'd rather not know. But I like the idea of a younger audience. It's great to be sitting in a bookstore and having an 8 or 9-year-old with a stack of your books, and they've practically memorized every word of them, and ask you these terrific questions. It's just a thrill. I mean, I recommend it to other writers, because especially after years and years in the newspaper business, where you get a little bit jaded and a little bit cynical, to sit in this crowd of very enthusiastic kids and think to yourself, you know, they're very smart, and they're going to be running the whole show in a couple of years. They're going to be in charge of everything. And it does give you actual hope, which is an unusual thing to carry around these days if you're a writer.
That's great. You're an optimist.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but you know, it's still a good feeling.
Very cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the environmental themes that run through your books. Of course, there's definitely an underlying environmental theme to Scat. When did you first become aware, Carl, of environmental issues in such a way that you said, I want to do something about these?
When I was very, very young, because Florida at that time, especially where I was growing up, was just disappearing before my eyes. I mean, you know, all the little wilderness spots and little ponds and the creeks that me and my buddies, you know, we hung out at, you'd wake up one morning and or one Saturday, and you'd ride your bike out there, and you'd look, and it would be flattened, every tree would be gone.
Townhomes built 6 months later.
All the survey stakes would be in. So, I mean, I was angry at a young age about it. I said, this isn't right. Aren't they going to save anything that I'll be able to show my own kids and my own grandkids? And so, yeah, I was pretty staunchly, I mean, I was aware of it. I wasn't as politically sophisticated as kids are today. I didn't know why it was happening. I just knew that it was just like, it's every day something new was gone. And in the case of scat, when we were kids, we were told that this creature called the Florida panther, this magnificent big animal which is related to the cougars and the mountain lions about west, there were only about 20 of them left, we were told, in all of the Everglades, and they were going to be gone by the time we were grown up. So don't even worry about it, and you'll never see one. But I mean, on all our little forays and camping trips and everything, we were always like, I wonder if there's a panther, and we're looking for the tracks, and you know how kids are, you have this vivid imagination. And we never laid eyes on one, at least when I was a kid I didn't. But it was like there was this great beast that was sort of clinging on, this far from extinction, that was out there watching us somewhere. And so I wanted to recapture a little of that feeling in scat about what it was like to be in a place like the Big Cypress Swamp, where it's larger than life, and you just don't know what's watching you. You know, it's when you're a kid, you're not, first of all, you're not really afraid of anything. You're just, I'm going to walk out here.
Invincible.
Invincible, and you think you're literally in the frame of mind that you're sharing the planet with all these great animals, and it's just something you want to see. So there is a mythical quality to that particular critter. So I try to take those pages and moments from my own childhood, because the old axiom that you should write about what you know, I think is true, at least in my case. And I've lived in Florida my whole life. I couldn't write about Alaska. I couldn't write about Montana very authoritatively, but Florida I know. Speaking
of Montana, there's a famous story that folks are probably aware of your discovering Christopher Paolini's first book at you said it was in Albertsons before?
Yeah, in Albertsons grocery store.
Tell us the story there.
Well, Chris and his dad had a printing press, and Chris wrote Aragon at home and did all the artwork for it for himself. Very elaborate, very beautiful artwork. And he would drive around Montana, and he would have on he'd have a whole costume on with the gladiator stuff, and he'd do performances and they literally sold the book out of the trunk of his dad's car. And I was in Livingston, Montana, and we were looking for something for my stepson to read when I think he was 11 or 12 or something, and my wife stumbles on this book called Aragon, and we asked somebody, and they said, that's locally, because it didn't have an imprint, a publisher
imprint.
Did
it look like a self-published book?
Yes, it did, but I mean, it was still nice, but it was clearly not a book that came from a New York publishing house. And I looked at it, and she threw it at Ryan. She said, "You're reading this in the car. This looks good." And so he grumbled and he complained, as kids that age will do. And yet we didn't hear from him for hours as we were driving across. I think we were heading over to Missoula, and I keep looking back, and his nose is in the book, and I think he finished it the next day. It's unbelievable. And he said, "This is better than Harry Potter." And I said, "Give me the book. Let me look at this." And I looked at it, and I saw that it was a local kid, and then I thought there was an interesting story. And I just looked at the writing, and I said, Chris was 16, I think, 16, 17 when he wrote that. It was very sophisticated, very good writing for anybody that age. So I spoke to my editor at the Random House Children's Book, Nancy Sisko, and I said, "There's this kid. I think you ought to take a look at this book. He's published it. He and his dad are selling it all around the state, but I don't know. It just strikes me as something good." So they got in touch with Chris, and we didn't know then it was part of a trilogy that he'd been working on, and he got a contract with Random House, and he's done famously. But let me also say that was a bit of serendipity, but the truth is he's a talented kid, and he would have been discovered, and it would have happened to him eventually, I'm sure.
How has your career as a journalist influenced your fiction writing?
Well, a lot, because all of my novels, including the kids' books, are set in contemporary, in the here and now. And as a journalist, that's sort of your reflex to write about whatever's happening right now. And the material that you get living in a place like South Florida is so rich. I mean, it's terrifying if you're just visiting, but we're used to this parade of weirdness and bizarre behavior, and every day there's something in the paper that I might clip out or take note of for a novel. I mean, it's a very fertile area for a writer to live in, and especially if you're born and raised and you care about the place and you got a little bit of passion and anger that goes with it. Because as I tell people, even though the books are funny, the kind of humor I write, the satirical humor I write, and this is true going back in history, that most that usually comes from sort of a sense of injustice and a little bit of anger and frustration that this place you care about or something you care about isn't the way it should be, and that makes the books, I think, have a sharper edge, and it also adds the humor.
It's fascinating. So why satire? Is it just something that you've written for a long time? What is it about satire?
Well, I like to make people laugh. I mean, I think I've always, going back to when I was in school, I was always like the smallest kid in class. So as a defense mechanism, you develop a sense of humor at an early age, or you get your butt kicked. And I found that if I could make the bullies laugh, they would move on and pester somebody else. But I also liked, and at a very young age, was writing things and showing them to other people and getting the kind of reaction where they'd read it and they would laugh out loud. And I sort of, as a journalist, came of age, and when I was in college, Richard Nixon was in the White House, and Watergate was breaking, and you had the war. It was a tremendous amount of material, and I wrote political and satirical columns both at Emory University and the University of Florida, and the feedback was amazing. And I thought to myself then that satire is, in many ways, a much more effective weapon if you're going to write about something that's wrong in the world. Than just getting up on a soapbox and screeching. I mean, that doesn't work, and novelists should never try to do that. But if you can write something, satire has a target, and that's the great thing about the kids who read these books. They know right away who I'm writing about. They know right away the point of view that I'm taking. I don't have to explain it twice. They get it.
Mm-hmm. So the characters for your books, would you say they're sort of composites of real life people? Yeah,
I very seldom meet somebody or say something, you know, I mean, I'll hear a phrase, or I'll hear a story or an anecdote, I'll read something in the paper, but I never say I'm going to put that person into a novel, because it's really restricting. You want your characters to have some freedom, and you want them to grow as you write. Mm-hmm. If you start thinking in terms of, you know, if you were going to put, let's say, the ex-governor of Illinois into a novel, you would be constrained in some way by your image of him, what he looks like, what he talks like, whereas if you can borrow a little bit of that weirdness and attach it to your own character and let him develop, it's a lot more fun, and it gives you a lot more freedom as a writer.
And there's a lot of weirdness and wackiness that runs through your books.
Yeah.
Where does that come from?
Real life. I mean, the people who've lived in Florida for any length of time, they look at my novels as documentaries. They don't see any kind of extreme edge to any. And when I travel around, as I'm doing now on a book tour, I do have to explain to people that this is right out of the headlines. In Scat, there's a scam that's being perpetrated. There's oil drilling going on in this area of the wilderness called the Big Cypress. Really true. They have oil drills out in the middle of this wonderful wilderness area. And for a while, the state of Florida made this brilliant offer that we will buy back the oil leases to preserve the area. Well, the oil leases weren't being very productive, so you have an opportunity there for people who see money, free money from the government, as putting an incredibly high price tag on these oil leases just to save this beautiful area, when in fact they weren't ever going to develop them. They weren't getting the oil out of them anyway, but they figure there's somebody in Washington dumb enough to write them a check, they're going to take advantage of it. And that's sort of the underlying bad guys in this book, but that's right out of the newspaper, right out of the front pages.
So humanity is we're sort of absurd, and some of the policies that we live by are absurd, and so it's deserving.
Well, grown-ups are, and that's why the kids dig these books, because I mean, I've spent my whole life as a journalist in the last 20-odd years writing this column for the Herald, really making fun of grown-ups, including on occasion my own bosses in the newspaper business. So when you write a book that sort of a novel, it takes it, kids really dig that, because they know that many times they're smarter than their parents, sometimes not, but sometimes they're a step or two ahead of us. And I have a 9-year-old in the house now who read Scat. He was my first, critical reader of Scat, and those are the ones that where your heart is really in your throat, because boy, if your own kid doesn't like your book, you're in big trouble. Thank goodness he gave it a thumbs up, but they're so sharp, and the things they have to read now, the literature that's written for kids is so much more advanced than it was when I was that age. You had the Hardy Boys, or you had Tom Swift, stuff like that. But you couldn't walk into a library and just have row after row of great novels to read. But they do now. It's great.
Let's talk a little bit about the business side of publishing, and I'd love your perspective on this. What would you say you've met a lot of writers. What would you say separates the New York Times best-selling authors, the top tier of the authors, from authors who manage to stay published but perhaps are more mid-list authors throughout their career? What is the major differences between?
Boy, that's a good question, because there are many very deserving authors and writers I know who haven't made it to that top tier. And then, and to be blunt with you, there are writers on any given New York Times list who you scratch your head and you say, oh, there's no God. You know, I mean, how could this happen? I always tell people, when you look at these bestsellers, there's always several books that are true literary gems, that are great reads, that are fun, that are worth being. And then there's some where you just scratch your head and you go, what is that all about? I don't get it. But I can't, there's no formula I can have. There's no magic answer. A lot of it is luck, a lot of it is hard work, a lot of it is tapping in. You know, in my case, they've never been able to find a category to put these books in. When I was first writing the novels for Putnam's, they would always end up in the mystery of fiction, and there really isn't that much of a mystery in my novels. The mystery is, how are the characters going to get out of this? How are they going to sort it out? But they're not whodunits in that classic sense of that genre. So I'm always amused to see them in mystery fiction, but they don't have a category for satire, and they really don't have a category for humor, and fictional humor. It's really not there, although there's a lot of great people doing it. Chris Moore and other, I mean, there's a lot of people who are writing very, very funny books, satirical books, Christopher Buckley. But I don't know the answer, because as I said, there's some days you say there really is a sense of justice. A really great book like The Kite Runner comes out of nowhere and really didn't have a big first press run. And then all of a sudden, there it is, because booksellers talked it up. They fell in love with it. And then you have other books that, just because the name is on there that you've seen 100 times, it goes right to #1, and it may not be an effort that you'd want to put into a time capsule and read 100 years from now.
Well, I think that's one of the big things, of course, publishers are always looking for is what is going to create word of mouth. What does it? What
well,
creates that kind of
a lot of it are booksellers, the people who do it for a living, and they'll read a book, and whether it's a kid's book or whatever, and they'll just say, you know, this is great, and they'll move that book closer to the cash register, and they'll move the display up. I mean, it sounds like a little thing, but the librarians are a wonderful source, especially for children's literature. I mean, they read everything. Their heart will open to a book that maybe commercially would not have found an audience. And so it is a little bit of luck, but it's also a lot of hard work. I mean, I always tell people who raise their hands and they go, well, how do you become a writer? I say, oh, it's real easy. You take 400 blank pages, about this much, and you go into that room and you write a book and you just come out, and then you've got your book. That's all it is. It's one of the hardest jobs in the world, and you beat yourself up the whole time you're in the room trying to make it better. So, and people who are hypercritical of authors, and I always say the same, even bad writing is hard work. I mean, it is. Someone bled and sweat over those pages, and it may not have turned out into what you think is a good read, but they had to work hard to get there. It didn't just materialize. And so it's a lot of hard work and a lot of just believing in yourself and keeping your fingers crossed. And I still am a believer, even in this economy where the publishers are spending less and less on finding new authors. They're really, that pool of money has shrunk, but I still believe that the really talented people do get discovered, and it may take them a little longer, and they will get published. I've just seen it happen again and again.
I wonder if your perspective on your own writing, you mentioned, sort of beating yourself up about a novel and whether it's any good or whether the storyline's going the right way or the characters, interesting enough. Has your perspective on your own writing changed, from tourist season to now that you've had a lot of success? You've had a lot of commercial success.
I've been very
Do you feel more secure as
No, you never feel secure. You feel, I mean, the trick is, the whole idea is to get better every time and not to jump through the same hoop over and over again. It's why I don't have a recurring detective guy in all 11 of these novels. I've got a few characters that'll drift in and out that I'm fond of, and I'll bring them back for cameos, but I do like to kind of start with a clean slate. But you're always trying to get better. You're always trying to do something a little different, and it's a tricky thing especially when you're trying to be funny and keep the narrative pace and be dealing with things that are in some way serious at the same time. But your job as a writer is to entertain. I mean, that's what they're paying you to do. Make people turn the pages. That's what you get the most satisfaction from. So you're always, I mean, every book that I'm send off, the last draft, it's due tomorrow. We got, they have to practically pry it from my hands because I have the old newspaper instinct of you can always make something better. It's never as good as it could be, and all the way out the door you're thinking, no, that's the wrong adjective. Oh, no, that's a bad quote. You're just fighting, and you finally have to let it go and hope that. And I've had the pleasant experience of going back. Occasionally I get asked to read from one of the older novels like Tourist Season, which is going back 20 years, 22 years, and you kind of hold your breath and say, oh boy, am I going to be able to take it? And then I find things in there I'm pretty pleased with. I mean, there are things I would change in all of them. I see a line that says, that didn't work too well, but then I'll see something and I'll say, God, I wish I could write that well today. What happened to me?
Very interesting. Well, you've had a couple of successful major motion pictures made from your books.
That's a relative term.
How does it feel to watch a major motion picture adapted from something that you created with a computer?
It's not an easy thing to watch. I mean, even when you have good people trying their best to be faithful to the novel, it's always got to change. The story's always got to be compressed. Certain characters are not going to make it from the page of the book to the big screen, and you have to be brutally prepared to see that happen. And with Strip Tease, it was a little different. I kept a distance from it. Everyone was wonderfully nice to me on the set, but I invested a little more in Hoot because the audience to me I felt a little more protective. Kids are so, when they become devoted to a book, any little change they're going to notice, and they have noticed. The book is not exactly like the movie or vice versa. And so I wanted to be as involved as I could to try to preserve the spirit of that novel and and fight as hard as they'll let an author fight in these situations to do that. And I was lucky because Jimmy Buffett was one of the producers on that, and he's an old friend of mine, and he believed in the book. We fought some battles pretty valiantly, and others we did not prevail. So you come away at the end kind of exhausted, but then you get letters from kids, and they say, they'll say, well, the movie wasn't as good as the book, but sometimes they'll say, I like the movie better. So you never know. I mean, you just hope that some of that survived to get up on screen.
Very good. Well, I think we're coming down to about our last 30 seconds here. What kind of advice would you give to aspiring writers out there in 30 seconds or less?
I always tell all of them, whether they're young or old, what you should be doing more than anything else. First, read everything you get your hands on, and secondly, keep a journal. Every day, write something down, whether it's a paragraph, 2 paragraphs, even a sentence, to get into the rhythm and the discipline of writing, even on days you don't feel like writing, because that's what writing is. Whether you feel like it or not, it's your job. And it gets that muscle working, and that's what I always tell people, especially young kids. Start keeping a journal. It's all yours. Don't show it to anybody.
Very good. Well, for all of us here at the Artist Craft, the hard crew, Marnie and Michael working in the back, we'd like to thank you for tuning in. For the staff here at the Raleigh Television Network, thank you very much for tuning in. And thank you, Carl Hiaasen, for joining us in the studio.
Thanks for having me here.
Nice meeting you. So I highly recommend Scat, folks. Go out, check it out. It is on, I think it's going to be on the New York Times bestseller list sometime soon. We'll keep our fingers crossed.
Hope so.
Scat, Carl Hiaasen, thank you very much for tuning in.